All right, everyone, get ready for a really fascinating deep dive today. We're going to be looking at future prophecy. Um, More specifically, we're going to be looking at this concept of a tribulation period and some pretty interesting, thought-provoking connections to historical events like the Holocaust.
Yeah, I think, just thinking about how a horrific event from the past
Hmm.
might actually relate to prophecies about what's to come in the future, it's a pretty interesting concept, almost like we're bridging, the past and the future using history to kind of try to understand prophecy.
Right. And just so everyone listening is on the same page, the Holocaust was the genocide of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany during World War II. So we're talking about a really horrifying period of persecution, involved everything from like confiscating property, forcing Jews into ghettos, and ultimately ending in, the death camps.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to really grasp the scale of that tragedy.
Wow.
As we kind of delve into these processes that suggest a future period of really intense suffering, a tribulation, which some people believe will also target the Jewish people and anyone who supports them. It's kind of a chilling thought to consider,
Yeah.
one that raises a lot of questions.
Definitely. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk about this concept of a future tribulation. The source we're going to be focusing on for this deep dive is called Lesson 19, a prophetic discourse on the Mount of Olives. And it really gets into the details of what this potential tribulation period could look like and how it connects back to this super interesting prophecy that we find in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, the Olivet Discourse is essentially a record of, what Jesus was teaching on the Mount of Olives right outside of Jerusalem just a few days before he was crucified. And it's in this setting that he kind of lays out these intense predictions about the future.
Interesting. Okay, so to understand what Jesus is talking about, we need to go back even further, right? Back to the book of Daniel. And lesson 19 specifically points us to Daniel's vision of sevens, especially the timeline that's laid out in Daniel 9.2427.
Okay, so get this. The prophecy actually hinges on a very specific date, 444 BC. This is the year that the Persian king Artaxerxes issued a decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And from that point on, the prophecy outlines a series of sevens, which many scholars interpret as like periods of 7 years each. So it's like a countdown clock starts ticking from that moment.
So we have this specific timeline, and within that timeline, it mentions two really important rulers. One is the Anointed One, the Messiah who the prophecy says would be put to death. And then it mentions this other ruler who will come sometime in the future, who makes a 7-year covenant. Who are these figures? What's the significance here?
Well, understanding who these figures are, that's key to unlocking the meaning of this whole prophecy, right? So the source material clearly identifies the Anointed One as Jesus, the Messiah. And the future ruler, he's often interpreted as the Antichrist, this figure who will deceive a lot of people and will ultimately lead a rebellion against God. It's like I don't know, kind of like a big chess game, right? Daniel's prophecy is laying out all the moves. But there's these two main players that we got to keep our eyes on because their actions are driving the narrative forward.
Okay, so we're starting to build this framework, right? But how does this ancient timeline, how does it connect to what actually happened in history?
Yeah, well, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, Daniel's prophecy seems to have predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD by the Romans. And this happened, after the Anointed One, Jesus was put to death. But what's even more interesting is that the prophecy also talks about a future tribulation. And it says that this future tribulation will also involve the destruction of Jerusalem. It's like history might be echoing itself.
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. So we have this pattern emerging, a past tragedy connected to prophecy, and then the suggestion of a future tragedy that's also linked to this prophecy. So let's talk about the details of that future tribulation a little bit more. What does the prophecy say about what this will look like?
Well, Daniel 9.27 describes this future tribulation as a 7-year period.
Mm-hmm.
And it says that this 7-year period will be split right down the middle. And the detail that always, gives me chills, it says that the Antichrist, that future ruler that we talked about, he will break a peace treaty with Israel right in the middle of those 7 years. And it says that this act will lead to something called the abomination that causes desolation. And it says that this will be set up in the temple.
Whoa, hold on. Abomination that causes desolation? That sounds pretty intense and maybe a little cryptic. What does that even mean?
It's a phrase that honestly has puzzled scholars for centuries. There are a lot of different interpretations out there, but essentially it refers to some kind of event or some kind of action that defiles the temple, and it signifies a complete break with God. So some people believe that this could involve some sort of physical object being placed in the temple, while others see it as more of a symbolic act of sacrilege. But What's interesting is that we see similar descriptions of tribulation events in Matthew 24.431. This is the passage that describes Jesus' Olivet Discourse. And our source material actually connects these vivid descriptions back to the timeline that we see in Daniel's prophecy.
Okay, so there's a lot of layers to this prophecy, a lot to unpack. But before we get into the details of those tribulation events that are described in Matthew, I want to touch on this idea of a prophetic parenthesis that's mentioned in the source material. Can you explain what that is and how it fits into all of this?
Ah, yes, the prophetic parenthesis. Okay, so imagine you're watching a movie, and right at a crucial moment, the story jumps forward in time for a flashback. That flashback is kind of like a parenthesis in the main narrative, right? Well, the prophetic parenthesis suggests that there's a similar gap or a pause within the timeline of this prophecy. So some people interpret this as the period between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy.
Gotcha. So essentially, there's this break in the timeline, and then this tribulation that we're discussing would occur during that final week or that 7-year period. It's like the movie jumps back to the main story after the flashback.
Exactly. And the idea is that this parenthesis could be a very significant period of time. We could be talking centuries even. And this helps to explain how the prophecy could seemingly be fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, but also point to a future tribulation that is still to come.
Okay, so let me try to summarize. We have this complex timeline with a potential break in it. We've got these two key players, the Messiah and the Antichrist, and then, of course, this looming tribulation period, which is marked by this abomination of desolation. It's a lot to take in, but before we jump into all of the little details, I think it's important to step back and just ask, why does any of this matter to us today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that every single listener needs to wrestle with on their own. But here's what I find so compelling about these prophecies. Well, I think it's because they really invite us to consider, the big picture, the grand narrative of history and where we fit into it all. Like they challenge us to think about the nature of good and evil, the persistence of suffering, and ultimately the hope that God is working out his purposes even in the midst of all the chaos.
I like that. Yeah. It's not just about, decoding some timeline or trying to figure out who the Antichrist is. It's about grappling with these huge questions about humanity and our place in the universe. But I'm still a little bit fuzzy on the connection between all of this and the Holocaust. We talked about it at the beginning, but how does this horrific event from the past actually tie into these prophecies about the future?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one that I think a lot of people struggle with. The Holocaust itself, it's not specifically mentioned in biblical prophecy. But some scholars and theologians, they see these really chilling parallels between the persecution of the Jews during that time and the suffering that's predicted to happen during the tribulation period.
So it's not like a direct correlation, but more of a thematic connection, like a horrifying echo of history.
Exactly. Think about it, The Holocaust was a systematic attempt to just wipe out a whole group of people simply because of their ethnicity and religion. And in Daniel and Matthew, we see descriptions of this future time where the Antichrist will specifically target Israel and anyone who supports them. So some people believe that the Holocaust could even be seen as a kind of foreshadowing of this future persecution.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But yeah, I can see the parallels there for sure. It's like history might be repeating itself, only this time on a much larger and even more terrible scale.
And that's exactly why I think these prophecies are so important to think about. They're not just like abstract theological concepts. They have the potential to change our understanding of history. They can shed light on the patterns of human behavior. And I think they should challenge us to really think critically about the forces that are at work in the world right now today.
I'm starting to see why you find this stuff so interesting.
Yeah, it's not just predictions. It's like prompts for reflection and maybe even like action. But let's go back to the specifics for a minute. Let's talk about what's laid out in the Olivet Discourse. What are some of the key events and signs that are associated with this tribulation period?
Well, Matthew 24 paints a pretty vivid picture. Jesus talks about this widespread deception that's going to happen with false prophets popping up everywhere and leading people astray. And he talks about wars and rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. And he describes famines and earthquakes happening all over the place. Just total breakdown of, societal order and increase in lawlessness. And maybe the most chilling thing, he talks about believers being hated by everyone, all nations, just because of their faith.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a period of just like intense global upheaval. It's almost like a perfect storm of conflict, natural disaster, and persecution. Yeah, and it all culminates in, the coming of the Son of Man, Jesus himself returning in glory. The source material describes it as like this huge cosmic event. The sun and moon will be darkened, stars are going to be falling from the sky. It says the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. It's a pretty dramatic and powerful image of God intervening in human history.
So amidst all the chaos and the suffering, there's also this sense of hope, like ultimate victory. It's like a dark tunnel with a light at the end.
Exactly. And that's a crucial point. I think these prophecies, they aren't meant to just scare people or make us feel hopeless. They're meant to point us toward a future where ultimately God will triumph over evil and, establish his kingdom.
Okay. I think I'm starting to see the big picture now. But I want to circle back to the Lesson 19 source material for just a second. It mentions something called keys to unlocking Daniel's vision of sevens. Can we maybe break those down and see how they help us make sense of all of this?
Absolutely. The Lesson 19 source material highlights several key points that can really help us wrap our heads around Daniel's prophecy. And, we've already talked about most of them as we've been discussing all this.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's all starting to come together now. Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first key?
Well, the first key is that specific date that we talked about, 444 BC, when that decree to rebuild Jerusalem was issued. That's our starting point, like our anchor for this whole timeline of the prophecy. Everything flows from that moment.
Right, like our mile marker 0. And then we've got the identification of these two key players, the Messiah, who is put to death, and the future ruler who makes the 7-year covenant. And, our source material identifies the Messiah as Jesus, and the future ruler, well, he's often interpreted as the Antichrist.
Yeah, you got it. Understanding who those figures are is just crucial to, unpacking the meaning of this whole prophecy. I mean, they're the driving forces behind, all the events that unfold.
Okay, so we've got our starting day, our key players. What else do we need to unlock this prophecy?
Well, the next key is understanding the whole concept of sevens as periods of 7 years. This isn't just random, The number 7 has a lot of symbolic meaning in biblical numerology. It represents, completeness, perfection, and even divine judgment. So when we see these 7s in Daniel's prophecy, we're not just talking about random chunks of time. We're talking about periods that are, packed with meaning.
That's fascinating. I never thought about the numerology aspect of it before. So we're dealing with these divinely ordained periods of time. And within that framework, we have all these events that are predicted to occur. You mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the coming of the Antichrist, the breaking of the covenant, and the tribulation period itself. It's like we're putting together this massive historical and prophetic puzzle.
And don't forget about that final key, that prophetic parenthesis, that potential gap in time between the 69th and 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. It helps us reconcile how the prophecy could have been fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, but also point to a future tribulation that hasn't happened yet. It's like a pause in the story, a time when God's purposes seem to be hidden, but then the story picks back up with even more intensity.
Okay, so we've got the keys, the timeline, the events. But there's still this huge question. What does it all mean for us? How do we make sense of all this and apply it to our lives?
Well, that's the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a question that I don't think anyone can answer, definitively. But this is where it gets really interesting. I think it's because, these prophecies, as complex and maybe even a little unsettling as they can be, I think they offer us this really unique opportunity. They make us examine our own lives, our priorities and how we understand, the world around us. They invite us to think about the big picture, to think about these spiritual forces that are at work and to ask ourselves what really matters, in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. It's not just about predicting the future, decoding this timeline. It's about using these prophecies as a lens to view our lives and the world around us.
Exactly. For some people, these prophecies might be like a call to action. It might inspire them to work towards peace and justice and compassion in a world that, sometimes seems full of so much darkness. For other people, it might be a reminder to just hold on to their faith and to find hope, even when things are really difficult, in the midst of suffering.
Yeah, I can see how these prophecies could have a really big impact on how people see things and the choices they make. It's not just about, sitting around waiting for things to happen. It's about actively doing something, engaging with what's happening right now and trying to shape the future in a way that's, aligns with what we believe and what we value.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about it. I mean, these prophecies, They're not meant to be a source of fear,
Yeah.
or like make us feel like everything is predetermined. They're meant to like empower us and inspire us to live in a way that reflects the hope and the love that, our faith is all about.
Okay, so it's not about panicking, it's not about despair. It's about using this knowledge to, you know, guide what we do, strengthen our faith, and try to have a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, precisely. It's about recognizing that, even when things are really bad, even when there is so much suffering, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a hope that goes beyond like all the chaos and the pain. And each of us, we have a role to play in bringing that hope, making it real.
Wow, that's a really powerful message. Yeah, it really like changes how we think about all of this, about prophecy. It's not just about, predicting doom and gloom. It's about finding like meaning, finding purpose in the midst of all that.
And you know what? One of the most interesting things about prophecy, I think, is that it often invites us to think about like different interpretations, right?
Mhm.
There isn't always one right answer, one clear-cut answer. And while that can be frustrating for some people, I think, it's actually a gift.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. Why do you think it's a gift?
Well, it forces us to, think about these ideas on a deeper level.
Mm.
It challenges us to think critically, consider different perspectives, and really wrestle with how complex faith and history can be.
Mhm.
Right? It's not about, just accepting one interpretation blindly. It's about having a thoughtful conversation, a meaningful dialogue about what these prophecies might mean for us, like both individually and, as a society.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's about the journey, it's not just about arriving at some like fixed destination. It's about being humble enough to admit that we might not have all the answers.
Absolutely. And I think that's sort of the most important things we can take away from this whole deep dive. It's not about like having all the answers. It's about being open to asking the right questions. It's about wrestling with these complex ideas in a way that makes our faith stronger, makes us more resolute, and inspires us to like live lives that have purpose and meaning.
This has been a really, really incredible journey. I mean, we started by talking about the Holocaust. We dug into Daniel's prophecy of 77s, unpacked this thing called the Olivet Discourse, and really wrestled with what it all means for us today, in the 21st century.
And like always, the most important part of this whole journey is what you, the listener, what you take away from it.
Yeah.
What really stood out to you? What questions are you still thinking about? What new insights did you gain?
We really encourage you to, keep looking into the source material, dive deeper into these prophecies, and, have some conversations about these really complex issues with, your friends, your family, whoever.
And remember, like this journey of trying to understand, it's an ongoing process. The more we learn, the more we discover about ourselves, about the world around us, and where we fit in, in God's plan.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. Given everything we've talked about today about the tribulation and how it connects to, suffering in the past, how does understanding all of this change how you see current events? How can you be, a light in the darkness? How can you be a force for good in a world that, so often feels hopeless? Until next time, keep diving deeper, keep searching for the truth, and keep the conversation going.